Before 1901, Australia was not considered an independent nation. It fell under the rule and law of Great Britain. Nations form and develop in a variety of ways. Some, such as Great Britain, have evolved over more than 1,000 years. Others, like Italy and Germany, were formed through the joining of states and territories as a result of treaties and wars. Some nations, such as Indonesia and India, were formed as a result of decolonisation. Colonial powers withdrew from these areas during the 20th century, allowing them to become independent nations. The Australian nation was formed from 6 separate colonies that had been established on the Australian mainland in the late 18th and 19th centuries. These colonies joined together as a result of a positive vote from the majority of people in each colony. In 1901, the Australian nation was created. In 1770, Captain James Cook landed in Botany Bay aboard the HMS Endeavour. It was decided to create a settlement at Botany Bay for a variety of reasons, including a place to transport convicts. In 1788, the first settlement was created in New South Wales at Sydney Cove. When the first Europeans settled at Sydney Cove, there was no official recognition that the country was inhabited by anybody else. The concept of terra nullius, which means land belonging to no one, was the basis for the settlement of all Australian colonies. It was argued that as the Aborigines did not own the land, they could not sell it. There was a general belief that because the Indigenous people did not appear to have a concept of land ownership or use, they had no rights to the land. They did not fence the land, farm it or build on it. However, the Aborigines had a very strong bond with the land, which was the source of all their physical, social and spiritual needs. Hobart was settled in 1804 and was to become one of the harshest of the convict settlements. Overall, 40% of all convicts transported to Australia were to spend time in Van Diemen's Land. A lot of those convicts spent time at the notorious Port Arthur prison. In 1813, the Blue Mountains were crossed by explorers Gregory Blaxland, William Wentworth and William Lawson. The crossing enabled the settlers to access and use the land west of the mountains for farming and made possible the establishment of Australia's first inland settlement at Bathurst. For those going on the ski trip, we will be crossing through these mountains. Captain James Stirling established the Swan River Colony in Western Australia in 1829. The main city was Perth, and the port at the entrance to the harbour was called Fremantle. Unlike settlements in New South Wales and Hobart, the new colony was to be a free settlement, with no convicts. In 1835, a settlement was set up in Port Phillip, Victoria, and the foundation of Melbourne occurred. The Port Phillip colony grew very quickly, largely because of profits from wool. Many immigrants brought their flocks from Van Diemen's Land and New South Wales and took up pastoral leases. Melbourne developed as a processing centre and port for the export of wool, and by 1850 it was an impressive city of 22,000 people, with many fine streets and buildings, an art gallery, theatres, hospitals and schools, and beautiful botanical gardens. In 1836, South Australia was settled, and its capital city, Adelaide, was built on the Torrens River. Its first governor was John Hindmarsh, and like Western Australia, was to be convict-free. It was designed by surveyor Colonel William Light. The regular grid of streets and the border of parkland surrounding the city make Adelaide one of the best planned cities in the world. While the new white Australia forged ahead, many horrific things happened to the Aboriginal population. In 1838, stockmen massacred a group of Indigenous people at Myall Creek in New South Wales. The stockmen tied a group of 30 Indigenous Australians to a long rope and led them away. They took them to a gully 800 metres from their camp. There they slaughtered them all. The murdered were largely women, children and old men. The importance of Myall Creek massacre is mainly political, as this was the only massacre of its kind in colonial Australian history for which white people were brought to justice and subsequently executed. In memory of the Wirraray people who were murdered on the slopes of this ridge in an unprovoked but premeditated act in the late afternoon of 10th of June 1838. In 1851, the gold rush in Australia began. The most significant influence on the economic and social development of the Australian colonies in the 19th century was the discovery of gold. Gold tripled the population of the colonies and made Melbourne one of the richest cities in the British Empire. Half the male population of Melbourne and Adelaide left for the Victorian goldfields. immigrant ships carrying would-be gold miners arrived in 1852, and by 1858 150,000 people were living in the Victorian goldfields. The gold rushes brought 622,000 people to Australia in the 10 years after 1851. The impact of European settlement on the Indigenous people of Australia was disastrous. Contact with early explorers and traders introduced new diseases to which Aborigines had little or no immunity. The settlers that followed the explorers would push onto Indigenous lands, disturbing established territories and introducing new species of animals that would change the face of Australia. They would also threaten the Indigenous ways of life and spiritual practices. By the end of the 19th century, the destruction of the traditional lifestyles of the Indigenous people was almost complete. In 1889, Henry Parkes gave a speech called the Tenterfield Address. The movement towards federation is generally regarded as having begun with this speech. Parkes argued that we should be seen as one country and not as a group of disconnected states and territories. He thought we needed to present ourselves to the world as Australians. On January 1st, 1901, Australia became a nation. The Federation was achieved as a result of two referendums, one in 1898 and the other in 1899. In the second referendum, a majority of people in most of the colonies voted to support the new constitution that would create the Commonwealth of Australia. The opening of Australia's first Parliament occurred on May 9, 1901. This painting by Tom Roberts is on display at Parliament House in Canberra. While on our Canberra ski trip, you may get to see this painting on display. The Australian national flag was flown for the first time in September 1901. In 1908, the original 6-point star was changed to a 7-point star to include the Australian territories.